the motives for creating the emergency state were always national security, was always a national security argument. But the consequences reached beyond national security. The consequences reached to the international economic policy that we waged in part for national security reasons, but the way we wage it, the way trade agreements are fast-tracked through Congress, the way we don't debate things which are highly consequential, the way, although there's a debate around the margins of the size of the military budget, there's no real serious debate when we're in the Reading crunch that we're in now of what a large percentage of our spending and our deficit the military is. Look at last year. Last year, the government spent $3.2 trillion. It raised $2.1 trillion in taxes. Already there's a problem. I haven't mentioned the military. But last year, military spending, when you count the contingency funds for Iraq and Afghanistan, were $700 billion. The federal government raised $2.1 trillion in taxes, spent 1/3 of that on military-related expenses. That's a big chunk of the problem, and if you're a taxpayer, you see that where did my taxes go? What am I getting in return for my taxes? A large part of it disappears before it turns into interstate highway bridges that don't fall down, before it turns into a first-class healthcare system. So people say, and rightly say, the government is squandering my tax dollars. I could spend it better for the things I need because there's such a black hole that disappears. We talk about $1 trillion in cuts, $2 trillion in cuts in 10 years. Nobody will politically stand up and say, well, what about the 50 cents of every dollar of discretionary spending that's the military? It all lands on the other. It distorts our debate. It poisons our politics, as we can see in this year's campaign. It distorts the way we recruit and configure our military forces. We had a selective service system that divided the country in Vietnam. We have a volunteer army which solved that problem but creates another problem. It creates almost a separate military caste. It creates a country that can go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the number of families impacted are very small, and most people go on their business as before. It changes, it distorts the politics. This is not the way the Founding Fathers thought a democracy should go to war. People, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is a big issue. Why is the Second Amendment in the Constitution? Because the Founding Fathers thought back to ancient Rome, the Republic of Rome, a people in arms, which was a check on imperial war-making tendencies. You couldn't have a war unless the arms-bearing citizenry was ready to go out, leave their farms, fight in that war. Then you got to a more ambitious Roman Empire with mercenary armies recruited by generals like Caesar, and the whole political system collapsed. That's what Jefferson, Madison, and the others were thinking about. They wanted a citizen militia. You read the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, et cetera. That's the purpose of it. We had, at the very beginning, Harry Truman is not a hero of my book, particularly because he systematized the emergency state institutions, and he took the wartime measures of Roosevelt into peacetime. And when you have a peacetime emergency state, when does it end? When wartime ends, when there's peace. But Harry Truman, when facing the question, the first peacetime draft in America was the one before it wasn't before World War II, it was before we were in World War II, okay? And the question is, should it continue after 1945? We had 12 million men, mostly men, some women, in arms in 1945. They were signed up for the duration plus 6 months. People wanted to go home. We demobilized 70, 80% of that army, but it wasn't the safest of worlds. The Cold War was beginning. The question is, how would we maintain an army? Truman didn't want selective service. He wanted something called universal military training. That's very interesting, training, not conscription. Sort of the German model, everybody is trained because one reason we drafted people in the peacetime years of the 50s and 60s was to be ready to fight. Well, if everybody's trained, then if you have a declared war, you can call on those people. Having had an experiment with selective service, which wasn't happy, with an all-volunteer army, which isn't particularly happy, I think that's one of the things we might look at again if we're willing to get ourselves out of this emergency state frame. If I did it, it would be universal. It would be male, female, straight, gay. It would provide conscientious objectors alternate service, like the Germans and the Turks do. With that many people recruited, you don't have to be strict about it. People could declare whether they're objectors or not without hurting the military capacity, and they could do Peace Corps-like things or military things or NGO things, Millennium Development Goal things.